Officer harasses black man, realizes too late he's messing with the wrong person. Thanks, dear, your concern shows the importance of this work for you. I really admire your sense to imagine the situation in the story. Your recommended changes has been done with some more changes to impersonalize the investigation. The initial encounter. It was early afternoon, and the sun cast long shadows on the quiet streets of the town. Officer Raymond Hastings leaned back in his patrol car, scanning the area with a practiced, almost instinctive gaze. His hand rested on the steering wheel, fingers tapping rhythmically, not out of boredom but habit. Raymond knew these streets well. Most days were peaceful, but something about today felt off. It wasn't a bad place, this town. In fact, Raymond would argue that most days it was downright peaceful. But it wasn't perfect, and he prided himself on keeping a watchful eye on the undercurrents that could disturb that peace. Raymond liked his job. After 15 years on the force, he had built a reputation for being thorough. His colleagues knew him as a man who didn't let things slide. He wasn't the type to sit back and let a potential issue grow into something more significant. If he saw something suspicious, he acted. That was how he kept order, and in a town like this, order was everything. But today felt off. He watched as a man, well-dressed, black, carrying a leather briefcase, walked along the sidewalk, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Something about the man caught Raymond's attention, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the man's calm demeanor, the way he carried himself with an air of confidence that seemed almost too calculated. Or maybe it was simply the fact that Raymond hadn't seen him around before, and in a town like this, new faces rarely went unnoticed. Without thinking too much about it, he pulled his patrol car to the curb with a subtle screech. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the man, who had now slowed his pace and turned slightly, clearly aware of the officer's presence. "Excuse me," Raymond called out, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Can I have a word with you for a minute?" The man stopped and turned fully, meeting Raymond's eyes with a calm, measured look. There was no fear or hesitation in his expression, just a quiet curiosity, as though he was mildly surprised to be stopped but not particularly concerned. He was taller than Raymond had initially noticed, his frame strong and composed, yet his demeanor remained relaxed. "Of course, officer. What seems to be the issue?" the man asked, his voice steady and respectful. Raymond paused for a moment, studying him. There was something in the man's tone, polite but controlled, that made Raymond feel slightly off balance, as though this wasn't how interactions with civilians usually went. Most people, when approached by a cop, would show some sign of nervousness, but this man was calm, almost too calm. "Where are you headed?" Raymond asked, keeping his tone neutral, though there was a hint of authority behind his words. The man glanced at the cafe just down the street and then back at Raymond. "I'm on my way to grab some coffee before heading to a meeting. Is there something wrong?" The question, though innocuous, felt like a challenge. Raymond couldn't pinpoint what it was, but something about this man made him feel like he was losing control of the conversation. He wasn't used to civilians being so direct, especially not ones who looked like they might be hiding something. Raymond shifted his stance slightly, trying to regain the upper hand. "Do you live around here?" Raymond asked, ignoring the man's question for now. "I don't think I've seen you in this part of town before." The man raised an eyebrow, his face still calm but now with a touch of amusement, as though he recognized the game being played and wasn't particularly interested in participating. "Yes, I live nearby. Is that relevant to something, officer?" Raymond felt his irritation rise, though he couldn't say why. The man wasn't being disrespectful, but there was an edge to his responses that made Raymond feel like he was being toyed with. He hated that feeling, being questioned, as though he had to justify himself. He was the officer here. He was the one asking the questions. "It's routine," Raymond said quickly, almost defensively. "I ask everyone the same things when I'm on patrol." The man nodded, though Raymond couldn't tell if he believed him or if he was simply humoring him. "I see. Well, I appreciate your thoroughness, officer, but I'm just heading to grab a coffee. Is there something more you need from me?" Raymond hesitated. His instincts told him there was more to this man than met the eye. Maybe it was the briefcase, or maybe it was the man's self-assuredness, but something about him felt off. He needed to push a little harder, dig a little deeper, to figure out what exactly was going on here. "Do you mind if I see some ID?" Raymond asked, his tone more insistent now. The man's expression didn't change, though Raymond noticed a slight tightening around his eyes, as if this request was starting to cross a line. "Sure," he said after a brief pause, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his driver's license. He handed it to Raymond without protest, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. Raymond looked at the license, his eyes scanning the name, Jonathan Bennett. There was nothing remarkable about it, just a name on a card. But even as he held the ID, Raymond felt like he was still missing something, as if this man, Jonathan, wasn't revealing the full story. "Thanks," Raymond muttered, handing the license back. He could feel the frustration building inside him, though he didn't quite understand why. "What's in the briefcase?" Jonathan blinked, the question clearly catching him off guard. He glanced down at the briefcase in his hand, then back at Raymond. "Just work documents. Why?" Raymond shrugged, though his voice had taken on a slightly harder edge. "Just checking. You seem like you've got something important in there." Jonathan's eyes flickered with something. Was it irritation? But he kept his tone even. "Like I said, it's just work documents. I'm not sure why that's relevant to you." There was again that subtle challenge in his words. Raymond didn't like it. He didn't like feeling like he was being second-guessed, especially not by someone who had no reason to question him. He was the officer here. He was in control. "I'm just doing my job," Raymond said, his voice a bit sharper now. "It's my duty to make sure everything checks out." Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on Raymond's. "And I respect that, officer. But if you've checked everything and I haven't done anything wrong, I'd like to get going. I have a meeting to attend, and I don't want to be late." Raymond felt the balance of power slipping away again. He had stopped this man because something about him felt off, but now he was running out of excuses to keep him here. He didn't want to let him go just yet, not without figuring out what exactly it was that bothered him so much about this encounter. "Where's your meeting?" Raymond asked, grasping for something, anything, to keep the conversation going. Jonathan's expression remained calm, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. "It's at City Hall. If you need more information, officer, I'd be happy to cooperate, but I'm starting to feel like this is more than just a routine stop." Raymond opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Jonathan had hit the nail on the head, and Raymond knew it. This wasn't routine. It was something else, something personal, though he didn't want to admit it. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them thickening with each passing second. Raymond could feel the weight of his authority pressing down on him, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like a burden rather than a privilege. "All right," Raymond said finally, his voice tight. "You can go." Jonathan didn't move right away. He studied Raymond for a moment longer, as though trying to decide whether to say something more. But in the end, he just nodded, turned, and continued walking toward the cafe, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. Raymond watched him go, his chest tight with frustration and confusion. Something about that encounter had rattled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had stopped Jonathan for what he thought was a good reason, but now he wasn't so sure. And as he stood there, staring after the man, Raymond couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The escalation. As Jonathan walked away, Officer Raymond Hastings stood rooted to the spot, his hands clenched at his sides. There was something about the entire interaction that gnawed at him. He wasn't sure why, but letting Jonathan go didn't feel right. There was a nagging voice at the back of his mind, whispering that he hadn't pushed hard enough, hadn't dug deep enough. A part of him knew he should leave it alone. Jonathan hadn't done anything wrong. He'd shown his ID, answered Raymond's questions, and hadn't displayed any signs of guilt or wrongdoing. But there was another part of Raymond, the part that couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up, that refused to let the situation go. He couldn't stand the idea that he might have missed something important, that this man could be walking away with secrets hidden in plain sight. Raymond hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. He wasn't done yet. He needed answers, and if Jonathan wasn't going to give them willingly, then Raymond would have to press harder. "Hey, wait up!" Raymond called out, jogging a few steps to catch up with Jonathan. Jonathan stopped mid-stride and turned back, his face calm but now tinged with an edge of annoyance. "Is there something else, officer?" Raymond met his gaze, feeling the tension in the air thickening again. "I just need to ask you a few more questions," he said, his tone firmer now, more insistent. "It won't take long." Jonathan's eyebrows furrowed slightly, a flicker of frustration passing over his features. "I've already answered your questions, officer. What more is there to ask?" Raymond ignored the question, pushing forward. "You said you have a meeting at City Hall. What kind of meeting? Who are you meeting with?" Jonathan crossed his arms over his chest, clearly growing more irritated by the second. "I don't see how that's relevant. I've told you where I'm going, and I've shown you my ID. If you have a valid reason for detaining me further, I'd like to hear it." Raymond bristled at the challenge in Jonathan's voice. "It's routine," he repeated, though even he could hear the defensiveness in his tone. "Just answer the question." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver, but there was a coldness in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. "My business at City Hall is just that, my business. I've cooperated with you, officer, but I don't appreciate being harassed for no reason." The word harassed hit Raymond like a slap to the face. He could feel the blood rushing to his cheeks, embarrassment mingling with anger. He wasn't harassing anyone, he was doing his job. He had every right to question this man, especially if something didn't sit right with him. But Jonathan's calm defiance, his refusal to bend under Raymond's authority, was making it harder for him to think clearly. "I'm not harassing you," Raymond barked, voice tightening. "Just doing my job. I'm just making sure everything checks out. Now, I'm going to need you to open that briefcase." Jonathan's eyes widened slightly, surprise flashing across his face. "You want me to open my briefcase?" Raymond crossed his arms, mimicking Jonathan's stance. "That's right. I want to see what's inside." For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing. He just stared at Raymond, as if weighing his options, deciding how far he was willing to let this go. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "Number, I'm not going to open my briefcase for you." Raymond's chest tightened. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Jonathan said, his voice steady but firm. "You don't have the right to search my belongings without probable cause, and unless you can provide a reason why you think I'm carrying something illegal or dangerous, I'm not going to comply with that request." Raymond's anger flared. Who did this man think he was, telling him what he could and couldn't do? He was the officer here, not Jonathan. He was the one in control. He stepped closer, his body language more aggressive now. "Are you refusing to cooperate with a police officer?" "I'm refusing to be treated like a criminal," Jonathan replied firmly, his voice hardening. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. You have no right to detain me any longer. Now, unless you plan to arrest me, I suggest you let me go." Raymond felt the heat of the moment boiling over. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who seemed to know the law better than most civilians. He could feel his control slipping away, and the more Jonathan stood his ground, the more Raymond felt the need to reassert his authority. "I'm giving you one last chance," Raymond warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Open the briefcase or things are going to get difficult for you." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're making a mistake, officer. I'm not going to comply with an unlawful request, and if you push this any further, you'll regret it." Raymond's blood was pounding in his ears. He couldn't back down now. He had come too far, let things escalate too much to simply walk away. He stepped even closer, invading Jonathan's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Open the briefcase." For a moment, neither man moved. They stood inches apart, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The tension between them crackled in the air, a palpable force that seemed ready to explode at any moment. Then Jonathan took a slow breath, his gaze never leaving Raymond's. "No," he said quietly, but with absolute finality. Raymond's hand twitched toward his belt, his fingers brushing against the handle of his handcuffs. For a split second, He considered taking Jonathan into custody, dragging him down to the station, and forcing him to comply. But something in Jonathan's eyes stopped him. Something that told him this wasn't just a regular civilian standing before him. There was a strength in Jonathan, a quiet authority that Raymond couldn't quite place. He hesitated, his hand freezing halfway to his belt. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered, his voice lacking the conviction it had before. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a small step back, creating a bit of distance between them. "Officer," he said, his tone softer now, though still firm, "I understand you're doing your job. But this has gone beyond what's reasonable. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to go about my day." Raymond felt his frustration peak. This was supposed to be a routine stop, just a gut feeling he'd had. But now it had spiraled out of control, and he didn't know how to pull it back. Part of him wanted to push further, to make Jonathan prove he had nothing to hide. But another part of him, the part that had been nagging at him since the beginning, was starting to wonder if maybe he had misjudged the situation. Maybe Jonathan was right. Maybe he was making a mistake. But admitting that, backing down after everything, felt like defeat. And Raymond wasn't sure he could swallow that bitter pill. Jonathan watched him for a long moment, as if waiting to see what Raymond would do next. When Raymond didn't move, didn't speak, Jonathan sighed softly, shaking his head. "I've told you everything you need to know," Jonathan said quietly. "Now, if you don't have any further reason to detain me, I'm leaving." Raymond's muscles tensed, every instinct in his body screaming at him to stop Jonathan, to do something. But for the first time, he couldn't find a reason to. Not a valid one, anyway. His pride, his need for control, wasn't enough to justify what was happening here. And deep down, he knew it. "Fine," Raymond muttered, his voice barely audible. "Go." Jonathan nodded once, his eyes never leaving Raymond's. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Raymond stood there, watching him go, his chest tight with frustration, anger, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just defeat he felt. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at him as he watched Jonathan disappear around the corner. For the first time in a long time, Officer Raymond Hastings wasn't sure he had done the right thing. And the weight of that uncertainty sat heavy on his shoulders, refusing to let go. The realization. Raymond stood there for a long moment, his body tense, his mind racing with the aftermath of the encounter. He had walked away from plenty of stops in his years as an officer, but this one felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about this man, Jonathan, gnawed at him. A part of him wanted to chalk it up to a routine stop that didn't go the way he expected, but there was more to it than that. It felt personal. With every step Jonathan had taken away from him, Raymond's frustration had mounted. Why had he felt so out of control in that moment? He was a seasoned cop. He knew how to handle civilians, how to manage tense situations. Yet Jonathan's calm, steady demeanor had thrown him off. The man wasn't defiant, but he wasn't intimidated either. Raymond wasn't used to that. He rubbed a hand across his face, still trying to piece together the puzzle when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Sighing, he pulled it out and saw a message from dispatch. Reminder: new sheriff starting tomorrow. Briefing at 9 a.m. As he pulled up the personnel file on the dispatch system, his eyes landed on the picture and the name Jonathan Bennett. Raymond froze. His breath caught in his throat, and for a second, the screen seemed to blur. Jonathan Bennett, that Jonathan Bennett. Raymond's heart dropped into his stomach, that name. The man he had just interrogated, the man he had nearly arrested for no reason, was the new sheriff, the very man who would soon be his superior. He stood there, the weight of the realization crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had just harassed the incoming sheriff, made accusations, nearly used force, all because of his own biases, his own failure to see the situation clearly. Panic began to claw at Raymond's chest. What was he going to do now? He had crossed a line, and there was no taking it back. His career, his reputation, everything was now in jeopardy because of that moment. Raymond turned, looking down the street where Jonathan had disappeared. His mind raced through the possibilities. Would Jonathan report him? Would he be called into the sheriff's office tomorrow, reprimanded, maybe even suspended? He had no idea what the new sheriff was like, how he would respond to this kind of misconduct. All he knew was that he had made a huge mistake, and now he was going to have to face the consequences. The fallout. The next morning, Raymond Hastings sat in the precinct's waiting area, his leg bouncing nervously as he waited to be called in for the briefing. The weight of yesterday's encounter pressed down on him like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity, and the tension in the room was palpable. Raymond knew what was coming. He just didn't know how bad it would be. At 9 a.m. sharp, the door to the sheriff's office opened, and Jonathan Bennett stepped out, dressed sharply in his new uniform, his face composed and unreadable. Raymond felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as their eyes met briefly. Jonathan didn't say anything, just turned and headed into the briefing room. "All right, everyone," Jonathan's voice was calm, controlled. "Let's get started." Raymond barely heard the rest of the briefing. His mind was too preoccupied with the impending conversation he knew he couldn't avoid. The moment the meeting ended, Jonathan called him into his office. As Raymond stepped inside, Jonathan was sitting behind his desk, looking over some papers. He didn't look up right away, and the silence stretched painfully. Finally, he set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. "Officer Hastings," Jonathan began, his voice measured. "We need to talk about yesterday." Raymond's heart pounded in his chest, his mouth dry. "Sheriff Bennett, I—" "Let me stop you right there," Jonathan interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've already spoken to the chief about what happened. An investigation is being opened into your conduct." Raymond felt the floor drop out from under him. "An investigation?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Yes, an investigation. What happened yesterday was more than a bad day, officer. It's about accountability for your actions and how this department operates. You had no probable cause to stop a citizen, no legal grounds to demand what you did. You escalated a situation that should never have happened in the first place." Raymond swallowed hard, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. "Sheriff, I didn't realize who you were. I wasn't thinking clearly." "It doesn't matter who I am," Jonathan interrupted again, his voice firm but not angry. "You should treat every person you encounter with the same respect, the same adherence to the law that you would give anyone else. What if I hadn't been the new sheriff? What if I had been just another black man in this town, walking down the street? Would the outcome have been the same?" Raymond opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He knew the answer, and so did Jonathan. "I'm not looking for an apology, Officer Hastings," Jonathan said quietly. "I'm looking for accountability. There will be an internal investigation, and depending on the outcome, there may be disciplinary action. I suggest you prepare yourself for that." Raymond nodded numbly, his mind spinning. He had thought he was in control, thought he had everything figured out. But now, standing in front of Jonathan, he realized just how wrong he had been. As he turned to leave the office, Jonathan's voice stopped him one last time. "And Raymond," Jonathan said, his voice softer now, "I hope this serves as a lesson. For all our sakes." Raymond didn't respond. He couldn't. He just walked out, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him with every step. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Raymond. The investigation was thorough, and as more details of his past conduct came to light, it became clear that his behavior toward Jonathan wasn't an isolated incident. There had been other complaints, minor, swept under the rug, but now they all came flooding back to haunt him. In the end, the department had no choice but to suspend Raymond without pay, pending the results of the investigation. The media caught wind of the story, and soon the town was buzzing with talk of Officer Hastings, the cop who had harassed the new sheriff. It didn't take long for the investigation to conclude. Raymond was found guilty of misconduct, and he was fired from the force. Criminal charges were filed against him for violating Jonathan's civil rights, and after a brief trial, Raymond was sentenced to 6 months in jail. The redemption. In prison, Raymond had plenty of time to reflect on his actions. Every day, he woke up in a small, cold cell, his life reduced to a series of monotonous routines. The man who had once walked the streets of the town with authority was now just another inmate, another name on the prison roster. The isolation gave him time to think, to really consider the choices he had made. For the first time in his life, Raymond confronted his own biases, his own flawed views of the world. He had spent years believing he was just doing his job, that his suspicions were justified, but now he realized how much harm he had caused. Not just to Jonathan, but to others in the community, people who had lived in fear of being treated the way Jonathan had been. Raymond wondered if he could ever be redeemed in the eyes of the town, or if he even deserved it. He had built his career on the idea that he was keeping the peace, but now he saw that he had been part of the problem all along. As his sentence neared its end, Raymond thought about what he would do next. He knew he couldn't go back to being a cop. That part of his life was over. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make amends, to start over, to find some way to contribute to the community he had once served. But he knew that redemption, if it ever came, wouldn't be easy. And as Raymond sat in his cell, staring at the cold, gray walls around him, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late.